Welcome to Hacking Postgres, a podcast about extensions, extension creators, and other interesting, innovative things in the world of Postgres. I'm Rai Walker, founder of Tembo, a managed Postgres company, and today I'm here with Sai from PeerDB. I'm not even attempt to say your last name. Welcome to the show, Sai.
Very happy to be here, Rai, and excited to be on the show. So, yeah.
That's great. I'd love to start with you giving us a little quick background, where you grew up and what were you doing before Postgres?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm Sai and I'm the CEO and co-founder of PeerDB. And before PeerDB, I was working at Microsoft and I was leading the solutions engineering team for all Postgres services on Azure. And this included, Flexible Server, which is like the main single node managed service offering that Azure offers. And then it also had Citus, which is like the distributed Postgres offering. Prior to Microsoft, I worked at a database startup called Citus Data, which built distributed Postgres, and it was an open source extension, and it has quite a lot of adoption. And I worked there for 4 years, and I was engineer number 2 or 3 in the San Francisco office. So I worked there for 4 years before it got acquired by Microsoft, and Microsoft acquired Citus to build their tier 1 distributed Postgres offering, which is now called as Azure Cosmos DB for Postgres. So right, for the past 8 years, I've been very much in the Postgres community, and in my day to day, I was helping customers to implement Postgres and distributed Postgres, and the customers included a bunch of SMBs when I was in Citus. And in Microsoft, it's Fortune 500 companies like AT&T, FedEx, CVS, running their large scale production workload. So that's a bit about me. And I grew up in India. So I went to a university called Triple Hyderabad. I was there for 5 years. And then I started off as a developer in a company called Epic Systems, which is a healthcare company. Yeah. And then I was very lucky that around 8 to 10 years ago, I got hired to Citus and I was introduced into the Postgres community. And now, I'm continuing my life since past 12 years, 10 to 12 years now in the Postgres space. And I'll talk more about what we're doing at PeerDB, but that's my background, right? So,
yeah, it's crazy when you think about pre-Postgres, after Postgres, after you get involved with an open source community, it really feels bottomless, or limitless what you can do inside of it. But, I don't know, the world feels shallow to me until you hit something like this,
So, I 100% agree. I don't know when I'm going to leave Postgres. I think I like that word bottomless, so I agree. So,
yeah. Your first, did you use Postgres prior to joining or at the company you were at before Citus, or was...
No, I did not know about Postgres until I joined Citus, believe it or not, right? Wow. In the company I worked there was a different database. It was a healthcare company, and then they built an in-house database using this language called Cache, right? Which is very old school, right? And then, but in my times at my university, right? 15 years ago, it was mostly MySQL, right? The LAMP stack, and I knew MySQL, but but Postgres is something that I didn't hear until I joined Citus. And then at Citus, it was all Postgres, right? And I realized how powerful this can get, right? And I think that it's because of the extension ecosystem, right? When Citus was built as an extension, extensions were very new, right?
Yeah.
And then when I went Citus was not an extension also. I think for 6 months to a year, it was not an extension, and then it became an extension later. So it was very early stages of the extension ecosystem being built. But then at that time itself, I realized that how big this can be, right? Because you're basically making Postgres more and more powerful, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, that's my story with Postgres. Right?
So how did you get the job at Citus? Was the job you took initially didn't require Postgres knowledge, or was it just they had to create Postgres experts out of nothing and they selected you for that? But how do you feel like you got that role?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? That's a great story. So, I was a software developer, right? And then I interviewed for a junior software engineer role at Citus, right? And then The good news was Postgres background was not required, probably because like I don't think there were many Postgres developers at that time, maybe, right? Like,
Yeah.
and I was lucky that like I got a chance to interview. But then in the interview, they realized that like, okay, this guy can talk well to the customers as well, right? Like, and then they didn't offer me a software developer role, but they offered me like a forward deployed engineer or a solutions engineer who would like interface with clients and help them out, right? Like, and then that's how it all turned out. So and since then, like I'm very, it was a very lucky opportunity, right? Because I applied for software developer and then I got this solutions engineer role, and since then I have not been. I'm very glad I got that role because I got to interface with customers. I understood their problems, right? Like, and it was a good mix of like my technical, passion and also my, talking to customers, like empathizing with them, fixing their problems, right? Like, so I think that really helped me in my career. So if anyone like, wants to make this switch, like from a software developer to like a solutions engineer, because you want to work with customers, like don't hesitate, just do it. So
yeah, it gives you some great perspective that you were able to take to, I'm sure, whatever else you did at Citus, which, I'm kind of curious, where did you go from there? Like, when did you start hacking on Postgres? Was it in an extension or was it in the Citus code base, which basically you're saying was a fork at the time, I guess?
Yes.
Lightweight fork, you would probably say, but yeah, is that, where'd you start writing code?
Yeah. So like, that's a great question. Like, I don't know. To answer that question, at Citus, I didn't write much code. So I was like the solutions engineer where like so I knew a lot of like the nuts and bolts, right? Like, Citus had like, 50, 100 settings. Postgres had like 300, 400 settings.
Yeah.
And then our goal was to basically, tune all of this together so that customers are able to run like hundreds of terabytes on Postgres, right? So that was a big enough, thing to learn and like, grow, right? Like, so to be honest, like I didn't like write code into Citus and like, Postgres. It was mostly like, understand. So like the solutions engineering team, the responsibility was to understand like the Citus from its guts on how people can use it, basically, right?
Okay.
So that was my role. And then obviously like translating that to use cases, right? Like that was also very important where like, you like translate this technology to like, okay, how can this help multi-tenant SaaS workloads or like, real-time analytical workloads, right? So that's what I did, right? So. Exactly. So so I was the first like solutions engineering hire for Citus. And then like, we slowly grew the team from a couple, right? Like, and the other solutions engineer was Samay, who is like Tembo's CTO, right? Like, and then he was my boss at Citus for like, 2-3 years. And then like we grew the team from like, 2 to like 4 folks basically at Citus. And then once the Microsoft acquisition happened, like, the team was very similar. Our work was very similar, right? Like, and now, but the challenge was higher, right? The reason is now, we were getting use cases from enterprises, right? Like where there were many, like, more nuts and bolts, and the scale was significantly higher, right? Like, and how do we, make enterprises successful, right? So we grew the team like it was like close to like a 8 to 10 member team, right? Like, and then, last 2 years in Microsoft, I got into the role where like I led the team, like grew the team, and like, I was in the same role for the past 8 years, right?
Got it. Okay. All right. And then you left Microsoft. How long has it been? A year now, or is it longer than a year?
Interestingly, it has been a year exactly. So like my June 1st was when we started up like officially.
Yeah.
Right. Like, and I left Microsoft like May 15th or something. So it's like, it's 1 year that like, we started up, and our journey since then has been like very exciting. A lot of like learnings for me because like I'm a first time founder. So it's been great.
So are you curious, as first time founder and CEO, are you writing code? Are you just committing doc, changes? Like that's what I'm, at Tembo, I don't really write any important code, but I do get commits, just to improve documentation or blog posts and stuff like that. But
very good question, right? Like, and when me and my co-founder were like started building the product, so it took around like 3 to 6 months, right? Like where we had a product which could like onboard customers, right? Like from June to like, December of like 2023, that was our like focus, and we didn't have a team at that time, right? Like, so I used to spend like probably 60 to 70% of my time in the first 3 months writing code. So which was like a lot of fun because I did that like after 8 years, right? Like then, so one of the very important commit that I did into PeerDB source code is a feature which lets you replicate data from Postgres, lets you replicate toast columns, right? Like in Postgres to like these warehouses, right? Like Snowflake, Clickhouse, etc., without needing replica identity full, basically, right? Like, so that was like a very intricate feature. And replica identity full is like this concept where you define the entire row as a primary key. And then the problem is toast columns are these huge columns where Postgres like doesn't give you the toast column until you set this replica identity full, right? And replica identity full could like actually incur more load on the Postgres database, which could risk like the Postgres database. So what the feature that I like contributed was basically enabling toast column replication without needing replica identity full. And it was a pretty intricate feature. It was like close to like I think 1,000 lines like PR that I committed. And then like, I told my co-founder that like this need to be like, I mean, we need to test this like very like, we need to stress test this. And luckily my co-founder is like a great programmer, and like he also comes from the open source community. And like, so yeah, and now that feature is being used across like a bunch of customers, right? Like, and nice. So, and then customers are liking it because, that reduces the load on the Postgres database, which is very powerful, right? It saves like 20 to 30% of CPU on the Postgres database.
Maybe real quick overview, what PeerDB is doing, what the product's doing.
Yeah, so at PeerDB, we are building like a data movement and a replication tool with laser focus on Postgres, basically, right? Like, and our vision, like broader vision, is to make it like seamless for users to move data in and out of Postgres, right? And moving data in and out of Postgres covers like a plethora of use cases, right? Starting from, database migrations or, real-time replication to like, say, analytical stores for offloading analytics, or real-time replication to like, queues like Kafka for real-time alerting, right? So there are a plethora of use cases around like data movement and like, replication. We want to be like the de facto tool to make it like very seamless for customers, right? That's our vision. Now we are starting with like a couple of use cases as our like main focus, where like we are building this solution which enables you to replicate data from Postgres to data warehouses. Data warehouses can be like Snowflake, BigQuery, ClickHouse, or also Postgres, right? Like we have a bunch of like customers who are using Postgres as a warehouse, right? And we want to provide that like experience like as fast as possible. I mean, it should be like a very fast like experience, and also it should be very cost effective. So we are able to see around 10x like performance improvements and are able to save up to 5x in costs, right? So that is one use case. Now slowly we are entering into the real-time streaming use case, which is like real-time replication to like, Kafka and like these message brokers. But that's like PeerDB, our vision, and like what our initial focus is.
Awesome. That's great. Why do you think you're building this? Like what caused you to go after this area?
Yeah. So what I observed, right, like I think at Microsoft, right, during these implementations that we were doing, right, like customers, when they were running, I mean, when they were trying to implement use cases related to data movement, right, like so they wanted to migrate like a fleet of Oracle databases to, Postgres. And as a part of that, like, okay, once you migrate to like Postgres, you need to have like a change data capture solution, which streams this data to like their warehouse, right? Across all these like data movement use cases, what I observed was like existing ETL and data movement tools were all like, generalized, right? Like their entire focus was like, supporting a bunch of connectors, right? Like then, providing a native and solid experience for Postgres, right? And I remember this specific experience where we were doing like an Oracle to Postgres migration, and we had this tool like which couldn't like catch up, right? Like, and we reached out to their like team to help us out, and their engineering estimate for this was like around 6 months, right? And then we in-house in Microsoft, we tried to like fix our tool called Azure Data Factory. We loaned like an engineer to make this better. And then it was very hard. It took like 4 to 5 months to like come up with an MVP, because just to integrate the copy command into Azure Data Factory was very difficult, because Azure Data Factory had a Windows runtime. It had like 500, 600 connectors, and like integrating a native like Postgres like feature was very difficult, right? After multiple such occurrences, like, we decided that like, why not build a company which with laser focus on Postgres for like data movement. That's where like it came about, right? So like, a bunch of like experiences at Microsoft, specifically Microsoft, where like ETL and data movement was hard for customers.
Yeah, that makes sense. What's been the hardest thing about building it so far?
I think the hardest thing has been, so what we are seeing is majority of the customers who come to us are customers who run at Postgres at the heart of the data stack, right? Like so scale is like kind of a, it's a given, right? Like they have databases starting from like few hundreds of gigabytes, and our largest database is like 15 terabyte, like a single Postgres database, like who is replicating to Snowflake basically, right? So in this scale, right, like, there are many like edge cases, right? Like one is obviously we have our magic sauce, right? Like, which is the hard part, where like, we do a bunch of like Postgres native optimizations to provide like a 10x faster like experience. We do parallel snapshotting. I can go into that later. So that piece is one part which is hard, but then the good thing is we know that, right? Like, we know how to like, make it faster. But then the other hard part that we're seeing like in our day to day is like, there are many edge cases where things could fail, and polishing that like day in, day out, right? Like to like provide like a reliable experience has been like, the hard part. And like, we are loving it, right? Like now, we are able to move like, 50 databases at scales of 15 terabytes also. So
yeah, it's interesting. I built we built some data ingestion tools on top of Airflow, and what was challenging sometimes is if it would fail, let's say something failed overnight, then you have to catch up. It's like you could always catch up because it was queuing for us. It was queuing in Kinesis, but you had to increase the the compute for the doubled workload. How fast you want it to catch up. If you want it to catch up 3 times faster than normal, you need 3 times the workload. But then you also run into like rate limits, perhaps, and where you're either pulling from or writing to. There's like all kinds of. Sometimes people have their systems pretty fine-tuned for normal workload, and I don't know if you're dealing with any of that. Like
tying to what you said, right? Like that's our like day to day, right? Like I think that's the reason, right? Like the way, one philosophy with which we operate in PeerDB is like every like team member needs to be first like a database expert, right? Like then a software developer. They really need to understand like the databases we work with, right? Like it'd be Postgres, Snowflake, ClickHouse, etc. Because we implement these optimizations, right? Like, we know that like, okay, if we hit this scenario, like we are doing ingestion on the Snowflake side in the most efficient way, basically, or like, the ClickHouse side or the Postgres side, like in the most efficient way. So like, that is one thing that, that is the way with which we are operating now, right? And every day is a learning experience for us, right? Like where, okay, we learn more and like, we keep implementing. But I completely agree with you.
Yeah, that's great. Are there some big milestones coming up that you're looking forward to?
I think so currently from like a customer standpoint, right? Like we have around like 20 to 25 like paying production customers, right? Like, and in the past like 6 months since we released, and from a revenue standpoint, we have been growing around like we are doubling in revenue every 2 months. Right. And we want to keep that up. Basically, I think that is one that, and that's hard, right? Like as your revenue grows, like, keeping that up is like hard. But the good news is that like we are getting harder and like more, challenging use cases, right? Like now, I think the immediate milestone is like, we release this new product. Like one is like, in our PeerDB data warehouses, like we continue growing at the same pace as we're doing. The second is we released like a new offering called PeerDB Streams, which is provides like a real-time streaming experience from Postgres to like message brokers like Kafka and Google PubSub, etc. So now our goal is to scale this out. So we have like a bunch of design partners, like pretty large-scale customers who are running in production, but we want to make this 10x like in the coming like few months. And so that's our primary focus. We launched this product line just like few weeks ago. and overall the reception has been pretty positive, I would say, because like the pipe is like filling up and we're doing a bunch of like pilots. And I think in that, like the value proposition would be more like there is this tool called Debezium, which like, does change data capture to like from Postgres to like, these message brokers. What we are doing at PeerDB is we are building a more native and a more simpler version of Debezium, right? Like, so one concern that we've heard from customers using Debezium is it's like, there is a learning curve and it's like, it has a CLI, it's like, hard to work with, even though it does a great job, right? Like what we did is with PeerDB is like, along with like, these native features, which help like 10x faster, like, data movement experience. We also, made like the CDC experience dead simple, right? The customer comes like in just like few minutes, they kick off this replication job, which is like, production ready, right? So that is our like, the short of it is like, on the warehouses side, like we keep growing as we are doing, right? Like, and on the stream side, right? Like, which is our new product, we, get more customers and like make this like 10x in the coming like 6 months, right? So maybe I'm speaking like a founder here, but like okay.
Yeah. So what do you have what's the most important lesson you feel like you've learned over your career? Can you think of anything that comes to mind?
I think the biggest lesson that I have learned, right, like is around the growth mindset, right? Like, I mean, this word is used like quite a lot, right? Like, but then I feel that like every day is a learning for me, right? Like, and that is something that like, thanks to Citus, I learned that because like I moved from a software developer to like a forward deployed engineer. And that was very new to me. It was very hard. Like I'm telling you, right? Like, I mean, technical sales is not easy. I mean, like it was very difficult to, speaking more is different from communicating like very clearly to the customer, right? Like, and I learned that, like, and since then I've always been learning, right? So I think, and that's what is helping me, I feel, in my founder journey also, right? Like I'm doing this for the first time, and like every day I'm learning, different things, right? Let it be how to, number one, like think of product vision, like running, the team, like, so every day fundraising, right? Like that's also part of like the thing, right? So every day I'm learning. So that I think is my like the philosophy with which I operate, where like, I want to keep learning throughout my life. So
yeah. Are there developments in the Postgres ecosystem that you're excited about coming up?
So one thing that I'm excited, right, like in Postgres in logical replication, right, like because that's our like day to day, we like really deal with like logical replication slots, right, like for enabling change data capture. One feature like which most probably is coming is failover slots, where the idea is like, if the primary dies, like the secondary would still have the replication slot. So that is something that I'm excited about, basically. And aligned with that, right, like one another thing that I did not bring up, it's still in experimental phases, and I think we will have something like in the coming 3 to 6 months, is we're also working on a few extensions to make logical replication better. So that is still in like early stages, and we have some very like promising prototypes, right? Like, but that is also something that like we are working on. We start contributing as an extension, right? Like thanks to Postgres, and over time, hopefully it goes up to upstream, right? So
yeah, great. Do you? I know this one's tricky, but do you have some favorite people in Postgres that you've met along the way?
I think you know the answer, right? Like, but like, yeah. I think my a bunch of like favorite like folks, right? Like I think in the one is like obviously I called out Samai, right? Like who is Tembo's CTO. Like I mean, we worked like at Citus for like 8 to 10 years, right? Like, and I learned a lot from him. Like he was my boss, and like we learned a lot from each other, basically, right? So that is one favorite person. So I'm rooting for Tembo. Yeah. That is one. The second is like I mean. Obviously, the Citus founders also, right? Like, I mean, Umo, Rosgun, even though they are not doing Sumed, right? Like, even though they are not like in the Postgres space now, but they, I think, contributed quite a bit to Postgres, because I feel that like, I mean, I should not say this probably because I worked at Citus, but I believe that Citus is the OG extension, right? Like, I mean, it is the one, which was built like 8-9 years ago, and then like it did bring a lot of value. And obviously, I mean, there was an exit and all of that, right? But more importantly, like customers use it at like, large production grades, right? Like we had like custom like clusters with like over 3-4 petabytes, basically, right? So yeah, so these are some of my favorite folks, right? So I might have missed someone. I'm sorry about that. So
what about, all right, here's my magic wand question. If you could change one thing about Postgres, what would you use that magic wand on? Can you think of anything?
I think, right, like I'll give like a more broader answer and then probably get into a more specific one. The broader answer is I feel that, like a solid, like and a reliable data movement experience would be very important for Postgres to be successful, right? Like, and I feel that, things need to change upstream for making this happen. It's not just like an ETL tool, right? Like which would take this to glory, right? Like, but rather I feel, things need to change upstream, and those could be related to, a bunch of things, right? Like one is, say, making logical replication faster, right? Like number one. Number two, adding like, columnar storage to Postgres, right? Like, because you have like, Parquet and Avro and that really improves like ingestion speeds into Postgres, right? So you move like terabytes of data in like few hours, like, versus like, few minutes actually, versus like, days, right? So the meta point is a bunch of like features need to go into Postgres like upstream to make like data movement and replication like, rock solid. And that would be very important for Postgres to like take over the world. So that's the reason we are building this company. So like that's the more broad answer. Now specific like question is, I think we more on the logical replication side, right? Like, it needs to get faster. Reliance on replication slots is a pain because like, it's, because that can grow and crash the server. So what about like having replication slots in remote storage, right? Like stuff like that, right? But it's all around data movement. So
yeah, makes sense. Do you have any contrarian viewpoints about Postgres or or even like replication, or do you feel like you're kind of a mainstream thinker? Like I'm a contrarian thinker, it seems, and I always love hearing other people say something that maybe not everyone will agree with.
Yeah, that's a great question, right? Like I think this will be indeed contrarian. So like one thing that I don't believe, at least in the medium term future, like coming like 4 to 5 years, I would say, right? Like that can change like, 10 years later, like is this concept of Postgres for everything, basically. So that is, Postgres community might hate me for this, but like, that I think is my contrarian view. And the reason I feel that is, I think Postgres for everything will work at like smaller scale workloads, right? Like, if you have like few, hundreds of gigabytes to like to a terabyte of data, right? Like, and then you tune the right way, which is not very trivial, right? Like, and you need like quite a bit of expertise, right? Like it could work for like few users, but then more large scale users who are like, who are not like Postgres experts, right? Like, Postgres solving every use case, like analytical search, right? Like will not be that like trivial, right? Like, and if you ask me like whether, this can happen in the more long term, I absolutely believe so. The reason is, there is a lot of, work being put into it, right? Like, you have Tembo, who's like building like some amazing extensions. You have like the time series extension, which I saw recently. You're doing stuff on like vector, right? Like, and then you also have, the PeerDB guys, like who are doing something on the analytical space. And then you have the Neon guys, like who are doing on the serverless side, etc. Yeah. But for all of this to like, come together, like in harmony, right? Like to, make Postgres for everything, I think it's more like 5 years away, basically, right? Like, so that is my contrarian viewpoint. And now in regards to our like vision, right? Like we want to make this happen. Like, because we believe that like for Postgres to everything, for this vision of Postgres for everything to happen, ETL and data movement and replication will be a very important part, right? Like, and, we want to be a part of this and really like want to make this happen. But like, that happening in the coming medium term, like 5 years, I don't believe so. Because like I've seen like, other databases in close quarters, right? I've worked with Clickhouse, I've worked with Snowflake, and we lost a bunch of deals like, at Citus, right? Like with these like databases. That is my, so I don't believe that it's going to happen like more in the coming 5 years.
Well, it's funny too, because like that's a contrarian viewpoint perhaps within Postgres, but it's a mainstream view outside of Postgres, probably, right? Like if you say like exactly. ask the Clickhouse people, they would say, of course, Postgres for everything is dumb, right?
So it's interesting that like I'm in Postgres since past like 8-10 years, and like I'm saying this, so like that's the contrarian viewpoint here, right? Like I don't think everyone would agree with this.
From our community. Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, well, I mean, to me, and just to defend the idea is I believe, you think of a power law distribution where, who raises the most money? You'd have these startups that raise $1 billion, and anyone who raises $10 million looks like, like is close, pretty much on the zero line of a chart. I think it's the same way with databases, that there are people with super heavy use, but it's a power law distribution. And if you took like the 80% of the users with the least most usage, Postgres can probably take their workload, or like what question is how far across that long tail of small usage is there? I also think, like, especially if you're getting started as a startup, we started Tembo because, I was working on a little project and I was like, okay, I need to do some analytical queries now. I know there's a columnar extension in Postgres, or I could just go fire up Snowflake, and I explored it's funny because I ended up choosing neither. I couldn't figure out which was the right columnar extension, because at the time, I think, whatever Hydra had started building their fork of PG Columnar. Yeah. And I just decided to just do the queries in my main database and just make it bad, because it was an early stage product, and you really don't need a second database if you have no users. It's like we often like over architect at the earliest stage, and it's pretty easy to move a workload into a specialized system later. I think it's a lot harder to reconsolidate things, so I just think like start with Postgres might be a better way of describing it. It's certainly not everything, not at every scale, but if you can get away with using one database, well, and again, I think like we have analytical workloads inside of basic user experiences now. Like if you're going to show a chart to someone inside your product, you have to data crunch some stuff to make that chart fast. You can't hit like
100%.
the full query and expect a good user experience. Likewise with AI, AI is now becoming a core experience inside of basic products. Startups that are building, they gotta get really clean data. They gotta send it to the AI. They gotta get it back. And I just think like what used to be like, oh, Postgres is just a transactional database, cruddy behind a microservice, and that's its job. It's too much for me to think that I need to grab 5 different tools to build my MVP. It'd be great if we could do it all with one system. So that's kind of where I start from, and let's see where it really scales in 2024. The size of even nodes on Amazon, VMs that are available are probably 100 times bigger now than they were in the early days of Citus. So like the machines can get huge now. So that means databases can scale much more in 2024 than they could in 2016, right? But no one knows exactly how much or how far. There's not a really good source of when will Postgres break, and so that's one of the things we want to try to get super honest with the community about, is like, here's where a breaking point is, and nobody knows this. Like I wish I could research this. Like question is, when should you leave Postgres and go to Clickhouse? Like show me a good blog post that analyzes that. Because
I think that's a great like point you bring up, and like we'll probably write a blog on this. The reason is we have a lot of customers like who want to adopt like a new database, right? Like and which could be like Clickhouse or like Snowflake, and and the interesting thing is like it changes per customer, right? Like because the number of workloads that you can run in a database are like kind of NP complete, right? I mean, like including data modeling and all of that, right? Like it's kind of hard to predict, and so like, but that's a good like thing where we could write a blog post where like see patterns on when this is happening, because that could be get great feedback to the Postgres community, right? Like, but I agree with you, Ryan. Like basically I think the smaller workloads, right, like can use just Postgres. Like it would just work, right? Like and then getting clarity on where customers are adopting, right? It could also be tied to the UX, as I said, right? Like, I mean, one problem that I see is like, so if you ask me, right, like if I'm running like a Postgres database, right, like I'll make it work for everything because like I'm a Postgres expert. I know the nuts and bolts. I know how to tune like index only scans, like using, different extensions, etc., right? So it could be also tied into the UX side of things where like, making Postgres usability more easier where like non-super users can use it more than what they're currently using for.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, everybody has, I mean, I used to build with Ruby on Rails, and it's really easy to have an N+1, page where you're doing one query to get the list of things, and then you're doing a single query per row, in an application. And like, it was a shame that Rails didn't tell you when you were doing that, but it's pretty easy to detect that stuff. Analytically, things like PG Analyze from Lucas, exactly. I think are helping to make it easier to correct your mistakes as you're making them, compared to the old days where, it was just very, it was a black box in a lot of ways. The database wasn't very, so many tools now, so many extensions to try to figure out what's going inside of Postgres. It's great.
Yeah. And I really like the approach that, Tembo is also taking in regards to stacks, right? Like where, you're not putting everything in the same database, but rather like it's like Postgres is the ecosystem, right? Like, and then, customers can have their like OLTP stack and their OLAP stack and they can replicate data, right? Like that is like very like intuitive, I feel. Yeah. Because like, I mean, having like a single database, like to run everything, I mean, that would be scary for like tier 0, tier 1 use cases, right? Like where, okay, this one affects that one, right? Like, and I'm running a bank and my bank like app is like slow, right? Like, so that concept of like having stacks and like, is a very intuitive way. Right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Cause I think again, like you're using Postgres as a transactional store. If you have the inclination to use it as an analytical store, like you're off in the woods by yourself, unless you choose something like Hydra, people who are building a business around that. But if you're just like, we want to run our own Postgres, but we want to run an analytical instance of it, man, that's a risky decision to make in 2024. I agree with you. So yeah, we're trying to basically bundle it up so that and have a vendor that supports it so that maybe you could make that decision more times than having to. The only other answer besides that is go buy a vendor who is specialized, So yeah, we agree it's a long journey, but we think we raised our company raised like $280 million for Airflow, Astronomer did, and I'm just like, I wish I could have all that money to put into Postgres because I think we could build something amazing with that. So that was one of the reasons we jumped over into this world from the Airflow space. But curious, like, do you listen to podcasts very much?
Yeah, I do listen to a few podcasts, like specifically in the Postgres space, like I mean in my work, right? Like, and I do that, like, and I did listen to like a bunch of like the Hacking Postgres podcasts also. And a lot of them are like from developers, right? Like, so it's a lot of fun, so yeah.
Yeah. What are some of your favorite? I'm always looking for a good suggestion. Do you have any, I mean, I know the Postgres ones too and listen to those, but are there any non-Postgres podcasts that you like?
So one podcast, right? Like which I was on that podcast also. And right, like, I did like, listen to a few of them, right? Like before that, and I knew that podcast, right? Like that's the reason I was like very happy to be a part of that podcast. Is like Scott Hanselman's like podcast around like Hansel Minutes, basically. So that's like a fun podcast, and like it's more than like it's very real, I would say, right? Like it's very less salesy, and like he goes into like developers, and like there is database angle, right? Like so a lot of things that are happening in tech, right? Like let it be on the app dev side, like the database side, right? Like, and also like, in general, like there are a bunch of founders also who talk about their journeys, right? Like, etc. So that is one podcast, like, which I would recommend. Right. So
awesome. Yeah, that's good. All right. Well, it was great chatting with you. Where can listeners find you online? Give us some URLs for PeerDB and for you, or, do you post on Twitter, like where can we find content from you or the company?
Absolutely. So like there is a PeerDB Twitter page, which I like, share, post the podcast. And then like, I'm also pretty active on Twitter and LinkedIn. Like, Sai Srirampur is my like tag on Twitter. And then we like ship a lot of content, right? Like I think one thing that the way with which we're operating is content is our currency, right? Like, so anything that like we learn from customers, right? Like it's like now it's becoming like very involuntary. Okay.
Yeah.
We like, talk about stuff and okay, this is very useful to the community. Let's like ship this, right?
Yeah.
We came up with a blog post right now, right? Like, I mean, we talked about, at what inflection point customers think of using other like data stores, right? Like I think that's a great like, blog post, right? So
Yeah.
The short of it is like we ship a lot of content in our like LinkedIn, like in our Twitter, like my personal like, handles also, both the company and personal handles. I'll share them as a part of this podcast.
Yeah, we'll link them in the show notes. But it's been great chatting with you. And obviously I've met you in person, but it's been great to catch up. And we're excited about our future relationship with PeerDB. And it's great time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rai, for inviting me. And like, thanks for like starting Tembo with this vision of like, stacks and like improving the Postgres ecosystem, taking it to the next level. And I'm also very excited about the relationship. And both of us are, I think, with the same vision of taking Postgres to the next level.
Yep.
But thanks for inviting me to the podcast and like very excited to be here.
Awesome. Thanks. See ya.